Shalom and welcome to another edition of Parsha Talk. I'm Rabbi Elliot Malamet in the Highland Park, New Jersey, the Highland Park Conservative Temple of Congregation on Shemet. Joining me, my good friends, Rabbi Jeremy Kalmanofsky, Anshe Chesed, New York City, Rabbi Barry J. Chesler, Solomon Sheikh, the Day School of Long Island. Welcome, gentlemen. We are recording this on day 461 of the war, 461 of the captivity of the hostages. We hope that each day, we've been saying this from the beginning with the anticipation and also the anguish. And we have to remember them. We are constantly thinking of them. In addition, thinking of the continued toll that the war is taking. This on this day, three more soldiers killed in North Gaza. We pray for the comfort of their families. We pray for the healing of all the soldiers wounded and those whose lives have been upended by this. And we go to Torah for comfort and for wisdom and for just a way to frame our story and to think through ideas. And so this parsha is a concluding
We
parsha.
also, but we also,
Go ahead.
as we launched, like we also to say that we're recording
Yeah.
this today. Terrible fires in Southern California, and two synagogues in Pasadena seem to have been burned to the ground. Although I understand in both cases, the conservative shul, the Pasadena Jewish Temple and Center, and the Chabad of Pasadena, they were able to rescue all the Sifrei Torah. But we should send our
We're
love and
sending
concern to.
them. We got to think of, this hemisphere as well. Terrible, set of events, sequence of events there. Vayehi, this parsha, rounding off, closing the book of Bereishit for us. We've reached this epic moment in the story, and also the story of our lives, as we've mentioned in the past. I just want to focus right at the beginning. I'm puzzled by the first line or the first request that Jacob makes of Joseph. We of course learn that Jacob is 147 years old, and that has its own significance. He says to Joseph, "Imna matzati chen banecha, if I find favor before you, simna yadcha tachat yerechi, place your hand under my thigh," which is the euphemistic way of
Always a delicate moment.
a delicate moment of claiming for a an oath. Asita ima di chesed ve'emet, also a phrase that has lots of resonance. We don't need to go there, but I want to talk about al natik bereni b'Mitzrayim, don't bury me in Egypt. And the question that I'm asking is an obvious question. Did he really think that he was going to be buried in Egypt? I mean, here he knows that he is, his days are limited, um, and he knows that he won't reach the age of his father and his grandfather, who respectively were 180 and 175 years of age. But you know how I know that? Because of the formula, right? Abraham 5 squared times 7. Isaac 6 squared times 5, Jacob 7 squared times 3, right? We've talked about that
Yep.
in the past. Okay,
Whoa, that's cool.
it is
Yeah.
very
That was from
cool, very
Sarno.
cool. So
But what I want to say, as long as you stop for a moment, is that
sure,
this actually frames the Yaakov story.
yeah.
Because way back in Vayishlach, when he's fleeing Lavan, Lavan had wanted him to stay in what we would call Galut in the Ram Naharayim. And now with his request, we understand that the people around Jacob always want him to stay. His voyaging was not necessarily something that well, I would put it like this. He saw his travels as being temporary, but his home was always in Eretz Canaan, but not everyone else saw it that way.
So you're
And so
saying,
he's legitimately concerned at the end that he not be buried in Egypt because we have to assume things are good. They've come, they've lived 17 years, they've made a life. Joseph has seen his grandchildren born, and Jacob wants to go home.
so this is also a cultural referent. I recall, in one of these classes, it was the history of biblical Israel, I think, with Avraham Malamat, or one of these classes about ancient biblical culture, the story of Sinua, this legendary Egyptian figure who wants to be repatriated and buried in his own country, an Egyptian who goes back, etc. In other words, the idea of repatriating someone to their ancestral plot is not an uncommon feature in antiquity. I would even suggest it's not an uncommon feature today. We are one day removed from the National Day of Mourning of Jimmy Carter, and so the body was brought to the Capitol and lying in state, and he will be buried in his ancestral um, home in Georgia, correct?
It's peanut.
Exactly. And so many of the presidents are returned to their place of origin. I would suspect that all of them are, right?
Right, and also more rooted in the land of Israel, I would venture to say that probably most of the people buried on Har Zeitim were not residents of Israel when
Uh,
they died.
it would be an interesting analysis. Certainly I mean, we are familiar with people who get, their final wish is to be buried. And we've talked about it in the past with our good friend here, Rabbi Kalmanofsky.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
to be
Just to expound upon this, the uh, look at the next pasuk there, pasuk 30. V'shachavti im avotai, and I will lay with my fathers. Now, I just looked here that the Rashi and the Ibn Ezra both agree that that is a idiom not for burial. Lie with your fathers, lie with your ancestors is an idiom for death and not necessarily for burial, because as Rashi points out, it says that David lay with his ancestors, and then a few bit later it says then David was buried in Ir David, which means that there was some space between he lay with his ancestors and he was buried. But I would say that this whole passage, now I am not entering into a question of the characters. Why did they think they might? Why did they, have some anxiety about being buried in Egypt? I think that this story at this point, and this Jacob, and then later with Joseph, is going to be a strong orientation of homeland. We cannot possibly overestimate how much concern the Torah in general, maybe most of all Bereishit, has with this is a homeland where we belong. And when we're not in it, when we're in that sense of galut, we feel at odds. And even if we're doing good in galut, as the Israelites seem to be at the end of Sefer Bereishit, they really, really, really want to emphasize that we don't belong here; we belong there. And
So just to add
so
to
I'm just saying
that,
that if he's going to describe death as being reunited with his ancestors, that's just not separable from being buried there.
so in the fact, Jacob is the first person to say that great line of Yehuda Halevi, Ani b'sof ha'marav v'libi b'mizrach. I
Yeah,
am in the western reaches, but my heart is in the east.
But look, again,
yeah,
it's a human story, and it's a human story that involves a little bit of planning. I mean, as a congregational rabbi, I encounter this quite frequently, where people who reach a certain bracket in their life and begin to think about their demise, and what should we do? Should we pre-plan this? They have their plots, and these plots are they tend to be with other family members. Occasionally it involves some complicated logistical transportation. I'm talking about the Northeast, the tri-state area here, where the furthest that I could get is the middle of Long Island, and that's pretty far, right? Um,
oh,
For some people,
especially when traffic is bad. It's impossibly far. It's like the other end of the planet when you're sitting there stuck
for
on the
some people, it's like my backyard.
My late predecessor, Rabbi Hilsenrath Zichrono Livracha, used to make a joke and said that these old Jewish guys went to Farmingdale to bury a friend, and they looked at each other and they said, "Doesn't pay to go home."
That's why they have a waiting list.
That's
But
why.
what I wanted to say is, it may be that part of the impetus for Jacob to want to be buried in Canaan is his concern for Yosef, who is certainly the most Egyptianized of the sons. And he's been out of the land for far longer than the 17 years that Jacob's been in Egypt. And he's the one who perhaps needs a kind of push in the direction that he's not an Egyptian and his home is not where he is, no matter how powerful he might be. And that may be part of what leads him at the end to request that he also be buried in Canaan as well.
Well, let's hold off on that for a second. We'll use what you just said as a kind of segue into a critical scene in the Parsha where Yaakov does die. We've of course we're going to just skip over the blessing, the testament that he gives to all of his sons, which is a very dense and complicated, poetic testament filled with lots of references to things that have happened and things that will happen. But if you go to chapter 50 where he dies, okay, very sad. Vayigva Yosef el Amav. He dies. He's gathered to his people. Vayipol Yosef. He falls on his face. Vayev Kvala Vayishaklo. He's crying on him. This is a theme, a motif throughout the story. Joseph is big crier. Okay, he asks the I guess the health professionals, harofim, the doctors, lachnot et aviv, to embalm his father, vayachantu harofim et Yisrael. So they embalm the Israel, Jacob, all right, because that's what you do in Egypt. You get embalmed. 40 days pass, and then after 40 days, he makes a petition to Pharaoh, and it says Vayidaber. It's verse 4. Vayidaber Yosef el Beit Paro limor. Listen to how it's worded. Joseph speaks to the household of Pharaoh. Imna matzati chen beinechem, if it displease you. Dabruna boz nefar. He doesn't want to go himself to Pharaoh. Speak into Pharaoh's ears. Avi hishpiani lemor. My father swore to me, saying, Hine anochi met. Here, behold, I am about to die. Bikivri asher kariti liberetz Yisrael shamatik bereni. In the grave that I have made in the land of Canaan, that's where you are to bury me. Vata elena vekbarat aviva shuva. And now, may I please go back and bury my father? And Pharaoh says, Ale ukvor et avicha. Go up and bury your father, kasher hishpiecha. Can you just take me inside that in the I guess the politics of this, the nuances here? I find it very, very striking that the most powerful person in Egypt has to get permission from Pharaoh to an exit visa, basically, to go and to the and that Pharaoh agrees. And and
Are you surprised by that?
I'm not surprised about that, but I want to calibrate the oath of Jacob and Joseph with the beneficence of Pharaoh. And then I want to ask a kind of summative question for the whole story, which is, in line of the theme that we've talked about, the development of the character of Joseph, the development of the character of Judah, the development of the character of Pharaoh, and the development of the character of Jacob. So how do we see, and here this is a Joseph Pharaoh question, how do we see these characters in relationship to each other, given that they're not quite exactly partners? They're not buddies,
So
and
what I would say at the outset is that by making Joseph swear, that protects Joseph. Because when he goes to Pharaoh and says, I have to bury my father in Canaan, he's not leaving the Pharaoh, he's honoring his father. And I think this idea of honoring one's ancestors is universal. It's not particular to the Israelites, because we see something similar in the book of Nehemiah, which is already in the Second Temple period, where his pitch to the king is, let me go so I could tend to the graves of my ancestors. And that's met with approval because people respect that. You
so
have to show some respect to the dead, and people will let you respect your dead because it's an expectation of everyone.
let me ask it in this way, which is, can you imagine a scenario in which you would have said no? And what would have been the repercussion?
Well, you want to avoid that scenario, so you do everything in your power so that you don't get to that point and then have to make a difficult choice.
Right.
So he plays his cards that he has as well as he can, and he wins the hand, so to speak.
Right.
Yeah,
I,
can you imagine a scenario when Pharaoh would say no? Well,
A few
yeah.
generations later,
I mean, even in this, you use the word beneficence of Pharaoh. I think that's probably right. Things are going good. Joseph has enriched Pharaoh tremendously. He has built the empire, which, by the way, you know, is betokening the Israelite slavery. In the last parsha, when Joseph has the kingdom by the throat, and they have no food, and he's got all the food, and they have nothing left to sell, and they say, "Let we and our land be avadim leFaro." And it's just impossible for me to not hear for a Jewish reader of the Torah when the Egyptians say, "We want to be avadim leFaro," that Joseph has built the empire that is going to enslave lots and lots of people, the native born and the foreigners like ourselves. And so at the moment, things are going great for Pharaoh. He likes Joseph. He's beneficent. He remembers him. He hasn't forgotten him. Unlike the Sar Hamashkim, who lo zachar Yosef vayishkachehu, who did not remember him and additionally even forgot him, and not like the next coming down the pike king who asher lo yadayat Yosef, who didn't know anything about Joseph. This guy's on this guy's colleague, not like one-to-one colleague. He's the boss, but they're on the team together. He's the assistant coach
he's a
and
trusted servant.
trusted
so
servant.
I want
So,
to ask
but
you.
I would make 2 points. Sorry to interrupt, Elliot.
Okay.
That first of all, your comment, Jeremy, makes one wonder what tune do the Egyptians use when they sing Avadim Hayinu? But the second point is a few generations later, when the Israelites are going to want to leave temporarily, they say, to go into the wilderness to worship their God, Pharaoh says no,
Right.
because that's a step too far from going to pay respect to my father.
So that's where I was going to go. Not to that specific incident, but I can imagine a situation in which a power, when receiving a petition of amnesty or exit, or give me a furlough, basically, to attend the funeral of my parent, and that's a jail situation where at the discretion of whoever it is, the warden or the state. Under what circumstances does a prisoner have a furlough to attend to the burial of their parent, or under what circumstances are they not? Now, to my knowledge, this doesn't happen very often. The prisoners, people who are jailed for, serious offenses, don't get furloughs for attending to the rites of passage of their family members. So this puts the context for me very starkly, which is, of course he's doing it as a courtesy, right? He could, the way of the world is, I mean, I have people who work with me who are my colleagues, and I am, the rabbi, so I guess I have, a certain accountability. And so when it comes to, you know, time off or a Shabbat here, a Shabbat there, the individual say to me, look, is it okay with you to take Shabbat, this Shabbat? And that's a logistical question, just to make sure that there's coverage, etc. Right? But that's a courtesy. Without that courtesy, they would go like, "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you?" And Jeremy, you have more staff with you. You probably have to sit months ahead and kind of plot out a schedule and say, "Okay, so there's coverage here, there's
I
coverage
probably
here."
should.
What's
I
that?
should do.
You
I
should do
should
that.
do.
No, but it's a matter of just running an organization. You have to know the schedule, okay? Right? I mean, and I can't imagine, okay, being in a position where, I mean, under extenuating circumstances, I have to ask permission for someone. As a courtesy, of course, I'll say, listen, I have to be away, you know, I'm just letting you know I have to be away. Okay. I have a superstructure. I have a board and a president and etc. And I have plenty of, legitimate leadership and seniority, but I just can't leave without telling you
Right, but
where I'm going.
there's there's also a pragmatic element involved too, because the employer wants to keep the employee relatively happy so the work doesn't suffer,
Right. Okay. So,
right? So, there are lots of times, exaggeration in my world, where people leave when they shouldn't,
right.
for contractual reasons. But you let them go because if they don't want to be there, you don't want them there.
But I
So
think,
here, it's a little
yeah.
bit different, granted. But in other words, if Pharaoh is a good leader, he's thinking ahead. And what would be the advantage to him saying no?
Well, of course, there is no advantage to him saying no, but it's a literary problem. I'll just put it in that frame because if I can imagine a situation where a despot says to a subject, which is exactly what you said, next week's Parsha, we're going to get, or Vaera, we're going to get the request, petition to Pharaoh, let us go for 3 days, and he says no, basically. That says you're under my control, and I will not give you the courtesy of worshiping your Lord. In fact, I'm going to control I'm going to control all of your movement. So here we have a certain kind of gray zone, which is I'm asking you as a matter of respect and courtesy because I'm your first minister, and therefore I just and I'm buttressing it with the oath that I've given to my father. And Jeremy, I go back to what you said. This has added force because there's an oath here. And Pharaoh so Pharaoh Pharaoh honors the oath. And Pharaoh, I've in my reading this year of this story, I've imagined Pharaoh to be a somewhat older, not no, sorry, somewhat slightly older kind of fraternal figure, not a paternal figure to Joseph. That here they are a team, but they're not a team. That this is, you know, president, vice president kind of thing, where the vice president is slightly younger, but has much more executive and oversight. And that he is a gracious pharaoh, but he's also had to learn to be a gracious pharaoh in his development, and he will acknowledge and yield to the oath. Is it a yield to the oath because he honors the God of Israel? Uh, don't know. I'll leave it to
No,
you.
I liked which one of you suggested that it's just human decency. But when Rashi comments on this verse, um, Joseph's verse begins, verse 5, Avihi shpiani lemor, my father made me swear that I have to do this thing. And Pharaoh says, Vayomer paro ale ukvoret avicha, so go up and do it. Ka'asher hishbiacha, as your father made you promise. Rashi reads it in tonally like, I have this obligation of huge moral force. And Pharaoh says, well, listen, he made you swear, and you swore, and otherwise I would never let you go. That Rashi reading of those two verses, which begin and end on the word swear, Rashi's reading is that Pharaoh really didn't want to do it, but he had no choice because it's just human moral decency to A, promise fulfill your vows, and B, to take care of your parents' bodies.
So he's a good guy, this Pharaoh,
He's
basically.
Well,
certainly not a bad guy.
Not a
I
bad.
mean,
but it
he,
also is going to
yeah.
point out the contrast when Joseph dies.
Well, let's go to
Because
that.
when Joseph dies, Joseph is not even, the brothers are not even going to ask. They're just going to bury him temporarily, give or take 400 years, in Egypt.
Let's read that because that's these are the closing lines of the book Hazak Hazak VeNithazek, where Joseph says to his brothers, I'm looking at chapter 50, verse 24. Anochi met, I'm about to die, or behold, I die. Elohim pakod yifkod etchem, God will remember you. Ve'ela etchem min haaretz hazot, He will take you out of this land. El haaretz asher nishba l'Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, to the land that He promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Vayashba Yosef b'nei Israel emor. And here it doesn't even report it to us in the kind of direct dialogue. It just after the fact. And Joseph swore to the children of Israel, saying,
So
"Pakod
he
yifkod
made
Elohim
them he
etchem."
made them swear.
He
Right.
made them swear,
Vayashba,
right? Correct. Pakod, God will remember you. V'halitem et atzmotai mizeh, and you will take out my bones from here. Okay, so on the one hand, I have this concern for the audacity of Joseph to make this pledge to kind of extract this pledge from his brothers. Again, differentiating himself from his brothers, like they all get to be buried in Egypt, but only I get to be buried in Canaan. But this obviously ties Yetziat Mitzrayim, because this is an element that's going to be present at Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus. It ties the book of Joshua, because at the very end of the book of Joshua, they take the bones of Joseph and they bury them near Shechem in the land of Israel. So all of that is understood. But here, in the moment that Joseph extracts this pledge from them, what are we to make of it? Are we making?
So this is Joseph the Redeemer, because he is the only one who thought that his getting into Egypt was part of a divine plan. And as the entrance was a divine plan, so will be the exit, because they will not go out to bury an ancestor. They will go out because that is God's will. And God will take them out and back to the land that where they belong. And I think it's an important part of kind of rehabilitation of Joseph. This is
I,
one of his great moments.
you think it's a great moment? I'm not as charitable to him at this moment.
You never were.
I never. I'm not as charitable to him because it's his fault. He got them all down there. And you know, leadership is all about the decision, not the big decisions, which it is, of course, but it's all the little decisions, the micro decisions, the where you're going to live, what are you going to do, how are you going to sustain yourself, when are you going to go back, and all of that. And thousands of little decisions were made here that are all attributable to him. And this sets the stage for some tremendous suffering. And he has to be aware of the fact that he himself is not a completely free person. And I read it last year. I read
So,
Joseph.
but no one in the Torah is, right?
No, of
Even
course.
Moses is not free.
Okay, but I remember reading a biography of must have mentioned of Benjamin Franklin by H.W. Brands. The biography is called "The First American," and the thesis of the book is: here's a man who, before there was an America, behaves like an American. Okay, and in line of that, I would say Joseph is the first slave, the first Hebrew slave, because he's directly subservient to Pharaoh, directly limited in terms of his freedom, and makes all of his decisions based on that, and enslaves others. And to me, it's not ironic that the last words, "Vayasem ba'aron b'Mitzrayim," he's placed in a box in Egypt. That's the epitaph. He is totally not free.
So I think you're perhaps a little too harsh.
Okay.
Um, so Joseph begins his career in Egypt as a slave in the house of Potiphar. When he goes to work for Paro, I grant you, as you eloquently said, that he's not free, but he's not exactly a slave. And one way I think of understanding the transition between the generation of Joseph and the generation that we'll see in Sefer Shmot is that Joseph is not like the other Egyptians, because in fact he's the one out gathering all the wealth for Pharaoh. Part of the problem for the Israelites in Exodus is that the Israelites have become just like the Egyptians, and that's why Pharaoh doesn't respect them.
Hmm. Interesting. Um, so here we are. We're at the end. I see this as a bleak ending, but you
You
know,
know, I think
uh,
the bleakness of it is really quite. I think that's quite cogent. Um, he's going to be buried in Egypt. I mean, he's going to be kept in Egypt, and he's not. You know,
Stored.
he didn't. He's going to be stored. He's going to be warehoused in Egypt. He didn't have the power. Clearly, by this point, he didn't have the power to do what Joseph himself was able to do for Yaakov. I mean, nobody said, you know,
make a funeral for me. Take me
make
up
a funeral for me, carry me back up to
Long
Shem.
Island.
Clearly, that's not in the offing. And as I said before, both when we were earlier in the conversation and before we started recording, I think that the real audience for this is the Jewish people whose consciousness of exile is massive. And so to end this first book, creation of the world, forging of the people, the initial covenant with the ancestors, is a message to the people living in the Egypts of the world and the Mesopotamias of the world and the wherever it is, the Greeces of the world, that they're Persians that they may have ever been. You know, there's a our bodies are in these boxes, but pakodifkod Elohim etchem ve'elatchem min haaretz hazot. God will surely take note of you and pick you up out of this land. So it's grim because there's a reality. It's hopeful because there is a covenant and a faith in a future better world. But let's also not uh, forget um, the verse immediately prior to any of this, which is Vayar Yosef leEphraim b'nei Shileshim gam b'nei Machir ben Menashe yuldu al birkei Yosef. Joseph, who was in jail, who was thrown into a pit, whose brothers first decided to kill him and then just decided merely to sell him into slavery. And Jacob says the same thing. I never thought I'd see your face again, and now I see your children. And Joseph was able to see great grandchildren to Ephraim and to Menashe, and they were born upon his knees. And you know what? A lot of suffering produced also Urevanim Levanecha Shalom Yisrael. You'll be see children to your children's children and well-being for the Jewish people.
That's such a great theme, and I would love to leave it at that, and just it raises the question: in what context are you telling the story? Are you telling the story in that context, which is, Urevanim Levanecha, and you're gonna, even though we're in exile, you're gonna be okay? Are you telling the story in light of, chapter 15 of the book of Genesis, which is, the promise that is made already to Abraham? We didn't even talk about this, that they're going to be slaves there. Was that disclosed to the descendants? Do they know the meta story here that they're going to be enslaved for 400 years and the fourth generation is going to be redeemed? Are they carrying with themselves that piece of data, that information? Are they telling their own stories in light of a larger narrative?
I
And
love this question because we don't have access to the story that they told each other in Genesis. We live in this is what Judaism is. We live in the story as we have told it in the post-biblical era and rabbinic Judaism and all the thousands of years of our people. It makes a little just if I'm speaking tightly about the plot, um, you know, it makes no sense um, to think that they don't have a message of exile and hope. It makes no sense if they don't have if the Israelites throughout their time don't have a sense of we are going to be lost, but we are going to return. It makes a little less sense if they knew it in detail that it's 400 years, because I'm imagining in four generations and 400 years and whatever, because I'm imagining that when they go down to Egypt, and of course Jacob is loba lahishtakel lagur sham. He was temporary detour. If they really knew the story in detail, I would think that they would have been scooting out of there a little quicker if they could.
okay, yeah.
So I would make another point, actually 2 points. So when you were talking about the generations, Jeremy, I was reminded of the building of the great cathedrals in medieval Europe, where there could be 4 generations of a family working on it. So the oldest, the great grandfather would begin, and only the great grandson would be alive to see it finished. But the two middle generations, they went to work every day knowing that they would not see the results. And that leads me to the second point that I've come to the conclusion, listening to us talk, that what Bereishit does and the Torah itself does is it turns redemption into a story. It's not a fact. It's not a moment in history. It's a story that we tell. And for the generation that will be enslaved, that's where the hope will be. We want to get free. We want to get out of here. We may or may not, but we know redemption is going to come.
That's
We
And
may
that could
not
get us through.
you and I may not individually, but we are going out.
Yeah.
what a great note to end on. And of course, we are living inside that story on so many levels, even, as we think about the contemporary, challenges facing the Jewish people, Israel today. This is the promise of redemption is still there. So with that, we want to thank you, our viewers, our listeners, for watching, listening to us. We really appreciate that. Thank you for being with us. Wishing everyone a beautiful Shabbat during this week, ending the first of the 5 books, Hazak Hazak VeNithazek, and Shabbat Shalom. We'll see you next week
Shabbat shalom.
of Parasha Talk. Bye-bye.